Welcome, everyone, to Using ACPF Outputs in Watershed Planning and Implementation. This is a three-part workshop today, Thursday, and next Tuesday for 2 hours each time at this same time. I want to start with some acknowledgements of who's behind all of this. The USDA Agricultural Research Service, their staff are the ones who created the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service is providing the bulk of the funding for development and training right now. The Iowa State University and Iowa Water Center are the home of the ACPF National Hub. Training and communication around the ACPF has been led by the North Central Region Water Network, Wisconsin Extension Service, and the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center. And in the past, the US EPA has provided funding for training and so on. My name is Marcelle Lewandowski. I'm with the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center. I'm seeing one person is having trouble hearing. Is anybody else, or am I okay with my volume?
You are okay, Marcel. We're able to hear. I'm typing a response right now. So apparently I've only got one person with an issue.
Okay, good. I mean, not good for Wendy. Okay, a couple housekeeping things. The first thing is there is a real short demographic survey that Janice is going to put a link in the chat to. And this is just the basic demographics data we like to collect on these events. So if you're willing, please complete that. These sessions, you noticed, are being recorded, but the only reason we're doing that is to make them available for about a week for participants. If you have to miss a session for some reason, this will give you a chance to listen to them afterwards, but you'll have about a week to listen to it. We're not going to make these available more broadly. If you have questions and discussions, use the chat. I know this is a large group, but I expect we should be able to get some interaction through the chat, and we'll have some breakout sessions on the third session. So we'll try to get some interaction that way too. If you have technical questions about Zoom and so on, Janice Kepka is the person who's behind the scenes here, keeping things running. You might want to jot down her email address there in case you have something that kicks you out of Zoom for some reason. She's the one to contact. The handouts that we'll be using throughout are at this link here, z.umn.edu/ACPF handouts. So make a note of that link because we'll be adding things there. All right, what else? Why is that not moving? At the top of the agenda, which is in that handouts folder that I just referred to, but at the top of the agenda are these learning objectives. And I expect that the people in this room, you've come here with one of the following questions. Either we've got these ACPF maps, now what do we do? Or second, maybe you're asking, what good is ACPF to my conservation work? Is it worth investing our organization's time and resources? Or a third question might be, how can I get the most out of the ACPF and what we've got here? I want to highlight number 4, 5, and 7 on here. Number 4 is recognize ways that ACPF improves the effectiveness and efficiency of conservation. Number 5, explain the technical concepts and the assumptions behind the ACPF. We're not making you GIS technicians in this training, but we do want you to be able to talk to a GIS technician, and we want you to be able to explain the ACPF outputs to people who are not familiar with it at all. And number 7, prepare to engage with staff and stakeholders in developing and sharing and interpreting these outputs. So I hope to give you some information and ideas and think about how to integrate this into your own watershed planning and work. Today, Matt Romanko is going to talk about the technical assumptions behind the ACPF. Next time on Thursday, we'll have a few people presenting on some in-depth examples of how they've used it. So this is your chance to ask messy questions and begin to develop your own vision of how to use ACPF. And then finally, next Tuesday, we'll talk about displaying and sharing the results and how to do that effectively. So here's that survey that many of you have filled out, and the link is in the agenda to the survey. If you haven't done it already, please add that. But based on that, we've got a lot of people from Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio here, as well as quite a few other states you'll see listed. The knowledge of ACPF is pretty basic. So if you're feeling apprehensive about your starting point, you're in very good company. For organizations, a lot of state agency people, a lot of NRCS people in the room, some research and extension, quite a few local government folks of various flavors, private and NGO, and a couple people from regional organizations such as the Great Lakes. I'm going to get the name wrong. Never mind. You can look at the list and make sure you get the names right of who is here. And also, I'll point out one of the columns in that table is who are your major partners? And take a look at that and notice just how many different kinds of organizations that people are working with. It really shows how many stakeholders relate to ACPF and using ACPF. Okay, session 1. I'm going to take a few minutes right now and just talk a big picture about ACPF, and then I'll hand off to Matt. Matt recorded this overview, which I'm assuming everybody has watched. And if you haven't, there's a link at the top of your agenda. And afterwards, I would recommend taking a look at it. But I'm going to highlight a few key takeaways. The first is to use the ACPF, there's 4 input layers that are required. There's a lot of other information you can combine it with, but these 4 layers are required. They're already available, designed for working at the Huck 12 scale for a lot of areas. Specifically, all these blue areas on this map have these layers, well, except for the 4th one, have these layers ready. And you'll notice that each of these layers have some uses beyond just in ACPF. So, take advantage of them for other purposes as well. If your area is not, if your watershed isn't included in this map, there is a utilities tools in the ArcGIS toolbox to help you create them. So it is an extra effort, an extra step if you don't have these layers already, but it's not insurmountable. The layers are layers showing the field boundaries in the area, 6 years of land use or cropping history for each of the fields, a subset of soil data from Surgo, and then the final layer that is not available on the ACPF website is the elevation data, the digital elevation models. And these are, each state handles these differently. So you'll have to contact people in your state to figure out where that one is. The second takeaway is hydromodification of the digital elevation model is critical, and it can be time consuming. So be sure to allow some time for making this happen and making it happen correctly. ACPF is all about figuring out where water flows, and the hydromodification is necessary for making sure the water doesn't get backed up behind culverts and the like as you're doing this. Takeaway number 3, the ACPF toolbox is doing terrain analysis, and that's what's really its unique strength compared to a lot of other tools that you may already be using. And when I say terrain analysis, it means analyzing the shape of the land to figure out where water flows. ArcGIS already has that capability. What ACPF is doing is it semi-automates that process, making it much quicker for GIS technicians. And then it combines that terrain analysis with that land use information, with the field boundaries, and with NRCS practice standards so that you can find out where practices would be appropriate options. Takeaway number 4, the output from ACPF is a menu of feasible options. This is not a prescription. You need to pull in other considerations and other opinions and perspectives to prioritize these options and determine what to implement. Takeaway number 5, outputs can be used behind the scenes by conservation staff to just make their work more effective, or it can be used as a tool for engagement to empower landowners and other stakeholders so that they can actually be involved in your planning and implementation. And finally, ACPF is part of a watershed approach to conservation. And it assumes that you're using a watershed approach. And by that, I mean that even if you're working with a single landowner, a watershed perspective and approach is when you're accounting for what's happening upstream and downstream. You're accounting for how the physical and social considerations interact at that watershed scale. And so that watershed perspective is a basic assumption to how ACPF works. ACPF is always run at a Huck 12 scale. You can combine it, outputs to get Huck 8 information and other, but Huck 12 is the basic level that we're working at. And speaking of watershed management, I want to highlight this particular publication, Successful Watershed Management in the Midwest, Getting to Scale. And there they define successful water management as a system that achieves water-related environmental, social, economic goals in a designated time frame, with the goals in the time frame agreed upon by a representative group of stakeholders. So there's always this engagement of multiple people working at multiple levels for watershed management, and that's where we're trying to fit ACPF into that. This is more from that same publication. I'm gonna just skip through this, and this list of ACPF outputs, which you are going to hear more about imminently. Is there anything else that I need to say in this introduction before we dive right in? Okay, the rest of today will be Matt Ramonko talking about running the ACPF, what a non-GIS technician needs to know. I should have added earlier, we don't have any breaks scheduled. So Matt, if you feel like it would be appropriate to take one, that's your judgment, use that as you like, or if people need to just step out as they need. Anything else? Otherwise, I'll hand off to Matt.
All right, thanks, Marcel. Give me a second here and let me share my slides.
And while you're getting ready, Matt, I'll ask Janice, oh, never mind, she is going to reshare the demographics link that was there earlier. If any late joiners did not see that, it is in the chat. And so we do ask that you provide that voluntary information for our reporting purposes. So with that, Matt, I will turn it over to you here, and we'll go from there.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So do you guys see my slides now in the presentation mode?
Yes, we are.
All right, great. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm gonna give this overview to the technical basis behind the ACPF tools. So hopefully as we go through this, you guys can ask some questions to try to get some clarity on some things that you might not understand. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get those answered to you as we move through this. So as I said, my name is Matt Romanko. I'm with the Ohio State University Extension. I'm a water quality associate. I work up in the northwest part of the state, really focusing in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So I'm excited just to be here and share this work with you guys. I spent some time actually doing some ACPF analyses up in this area. And I also spend a lot of my time just kind of helping figure out how we can help expand this technology in the state and really helping facilitate that process. So it can be a little bit difficult to know who's working on stuff when and where in the state, but I'm trying to coordinate a little bit here in Ohio and in the region. So if anybody ever has questions about what's going on in this area, you can reach out to me. My contact information's up there, and I'll be happy to talk with you about it. So for this presentation today, we actually had some good cooperation from some partners in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana to put this presentation together. We were really wanting to focus on this Western Lake Erie Basin region, and we thought that it's really valuable to have some local examples and some input from people actually in the region to kind of explain what some of the nuances are that go into doing these ACPF analysis in our region. Because we know terrain analysis and landscapes can differ from place to place. So having a little bit of local insight to what's going on in this area, I think is valuable for people from this area. But I think that there's just more generally, anybody can kind of take away about what we're trying to explain about the ACPF tools here. So our agenda today is basically just gonna go through all of the different ACPF toolboxes. We have a kind of structure set up for these tools where we start off by just defining what the tool is, what the purpose of it is. Then we'll show what the outputs from the actual ACPF analysis look like. So what those GIS layers look like. And then we're gonna go over and just discuss any kind of modifications that can be done with the tools as we're running them. Let's see. All right, so here's on the left is a kind of a screenshot of what the actual ACPF toolbox looks like when we open up the GIS and we're actually running these tools. You can see that there's 6 different toolboxes shown here that we're going to go through today. There's actually a 7th utility toolbox I'm not going to cover, but it's actually really useful for helping develop some of these databases and these data structures if they're not available from that ACPF core download tool. But we're going to start off with this first one, which is the DEM preparation. So we discussed a little bit of that in the overview, and Marcel went over some of the important takeaways from what we expect from doing that hydro modification and how important that is. But you can see there's several individual tools listed within that DEM preparation toolbox that kind of guides users through the process of getting that ready. Then we're going to go on and talk about the stream networks and catchments and the field characterizations. So both of those toolboxes will go through relatively fast. Those are both basically used to kind of develop some of the intermediate layers that are needed to run some of the later practice siting tools. They also output a few layers that can be really useful for just the overall watershed planning process as well. So we'll look at a couple of those. But then the majority of this presentation is really going to focus on toolbox 4, 5, and 6, where we go through the actual conservation practices that the tool focuses on. So the DEM Prep Toolbox, as I said, it's a series of tools to guide users through the steps needed to create a usable DEM product for use within the ACPF. So as I mentioned in the overview, that this data is collected usually from a LiDAR survey from airplane. It's really high resolution data. In order to run this in ACPF, it's suggested that the high resolution DEM is around a 2 meter per pixel resolution. One of the important things that I did discuss in the overview is that this LiDAR data is because it's sensed from that LiDAR from the airplane, that it's not really able to determine, where bridges and culverts exist on the landscape because it's sensing from above. So that hydro conditioning process that's really important has to be done in those locations to kind of edit the DEM to allow that water flow path to be modeled on the landscape accurately. The second toolbox, it has a set of tools to guide techs through the process of basically delineating the watershed, the subcatchments, and the stream networks based on that hydro-conditioned DEM that users made in Toolbox 1. So this part requires users to input or users' inputs to classify actually the different stream segments throughout the entire watershed. So aside from the hydro conditioning portion, this is kind of the other part of the preparation of ACPF that requires that hands-on work from the ACPF tech. They actually have to scan through the entire watershed and looking at these stream segments that were delineated, and we have to classify which segments are perennial and which segments are ephemeral. This is a really important step because some of the tools that we're going to use later to cite some of the practices, they take that stream network layer into account, and wherever there is a stream network that is designated as perennial, we may be able to cite certain practices. But if we don't have that designation in there, that part of the watershed might not have practices cited for that. So this is a really important kind of hands-on step that the technicians need to kind of go through and be really careful about doing correctly. And you can see a couple of examples here of what that is. So the picture on the bottom left, you can see kind of what that original stream network is. The ACPF tech has clicked on that section of the stream network right there that's highlighted in that kind of lighter blue color, and went in, and then you can see the picture on the right there. They've used the split tool in the GIS to make actually two portions of that line segment, and then they're actually classifying the left-hand portion of that. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer out. Here, they can actually classify the left-hand portion of that as a perennial flow, and the right-hand portion of that stream segment remains ephemeral. And it can be a little bit subjective as to how some technicians make these choices. A lot of times what we'll do though is we'll use high resolution aerial imagery, and you can zoom into this location. And if you zoomed in real close here, you could see that it actually looks like there's a ditch that runs in this field here where the water flows. So there's probably tile lines coming out into that ditch. Whereas if you get over here into the rest of this part of the stream segment, there is no riparian corridor there. So a lot of those riparian conservation practices would not make sense in that location. So that just kind of, I wanted to illustrate to you, I guess, why that is important to be done. These right pictures kind of show another example of how that stream network can be modified. So this is actually a location where there's a water body, and I think our technician here is editing that streamline so it actually the flow will be completely contained inside the water body. So when we're running these GIS tools, they're basically computer programming scripts that will take data in, they will process that data however it is, and they will give you the result based on how the code is written. So we can run into some really weird things that happen when we have the stream layer crossing in and out and in and out of the water body. So that's one of the kind of manual things that ACPF techs need to address when they're getting these layers ready to use for the rest of the tools. So we'll go into the next toolbox here, which is the field characterization toolbox. This toolbox has a few different outputs that we get from this. One of them is this kind of slope assessment output. So there's a couple of outputs that come. One of them is a slope raster layer and percent rise. But then the other one is the by-field slope statistics table. And that basically uses the field boundary layer to extract the raster data, the slope raster data in those field boundaries, and gives you basically some aggregated statistics for each field, talking about what the slope is like for those different fields. And then that table can be joined to the field boundary layer actually and displayed as a map. So that's what you're seeing there is the output from that slope table joined to the field boundary layer. And that can be really useful for conservation planners when they're trying to figure out what practices might make sense in different parts of a watershed, and maybe figuring out where they want to spend their time trying to focus on, addressing this with landowners. Another output from the field characterization toolbox is this runoff risk assessment. So this is a nice planning tool. So it'll actually go in and by each field, it will estimate what the risk of runoff is, surface water directly to a stream network based on a couple of the different GIS inputs. So it's actually looking at the proximity of each field to that stream network, and it's looking at the slope for that field too. And then by using those two inputs, it's kind of making this classification matrix here to classify the risk of each one of those fields from low to very high. And then as with the last one, the output from this tool is also a table. That table needs to be joined to a spatial layer like the field boundary layers in order to display that in a map. So that's what you're looking at here. And again, as I said, that's really useful for the initial stages of planning conservation when you're trying to do outreach and trying to think about who you want to reach out to in the watershed. All right, so we went through DEM preparation, stream networks and catchments, and the field characterization toolbox pretty quick. I'm going to go on now, and we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about toolboxes 4, 5, and 6. So the fourth one here is our precision conservation practice siting tools. And you can see under number 4 in the toolbox, there's all of those different scripts that we run A through G to kind of go through this process of citing these different precision conservation practices. So the first one is this depressions layer. So depressions are, are really common throughout the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. These are really relatively low sloped, areas of land that have this kind of hummocky topography that naturally leads to these depressional areas that are really poorly drained. These things sit wet a lot of times of the year, and they're difficult to farm. So these locations can actually offer some opportunities for conservation. And, that's why we've identified them in the ACPF toolbox as a resource here. So these can actually be really good locations to install a conservation practice like blind inlets, which is essentially an underground inlet for drainage water to escape out of these depressional areas. They basically keep all of the structure of the inlet below ground, and it's covered up with coarse materials like stone and sand, so water is allowed to infiltrate into that drainage system. But actually that sand and the material on top of it actually helps filter out some of the particulate sediment that would normally get transported into a tile system if you were using something like a tile riser in that location to help help dry out the field. So blind inlets are really, a nice option to consider in those depressional areas. Another practice that can be considered in those depressional areas is actually just creating new wetlands or doing wetland restoration in those areas, because they obviously sit wet a lot of time. If it's not worth it to even maybe consider the blind inlet, or you don't want to, then wetland restoration could be an option for an additional conservation practice in those depressional areas. So the outputs from the depression tool, this is what they look like here. So there's basically, they show the polygon areas on the landscape where those depressions are located. And then it's actually giving you another output there that's showing the contributing area around it that would feed into that depressional area. So those can be really useful for planning purposes, because if you're only going to cite a practice in one of those places, you might want to target the location that has the most area draining to it, or whatever other reasons you might have. But the tool gives you some kind of information with these outputs as well. So as with just about all of these ACPF outputs that are points and lines and polygons and things, you can generally click on them or somehow open up the attributes table for these, and you can see that there's some summary information for the practices. So the polygon attribute for the depression actually gives you information about the percent hydric soil that's in that area, and as well as the maximum depth of the depression area. And then the polygon for the depression drainage actually gives you the area that's contributing to. So you can use those to kind of plan what areas you want to focus on. So in terms of modifications users can make to the tool, there are a few here. The percent hydric soil in the depression, the default that they go with is 60%. So if it has a 60% hydric soil, that they will flag that as a candidate for some kind of practice to be cited in that depression. That can be adjusted by the user when they're running this tool, as can the depth to the depression, as well as the surface area that depression makes up. So depending on what your conservation strategy is, some of those parameters might be more or less important to you, and you can use those to kind of guide the process of what you're trying to do. The citing process here, so basically that just goes through the process, what the software is trying to look at in order to find those. So the fill process it's a GIS process that's done on the DEM. It goes through, it basically fills all of those depressions, subtracts them from the original DEM, and that leaves us with just that depressional area where we're citing the practices in the field. And then it kind of looks, so it looks at those, and then it looks at all of the other parameters and settings that you're allowed to set. And if it meets all of those requirements, that places as flagged as a depression and it's output into a GIS form, so you can see it on the map. All right, the next practice to talk about here is the drainage water management tool. So drainage water management is a popular conservation practice. These are usually situated at the edge of a field. These are structures that are installed in line with tile drains that allow users to add and remove gates inside of those structures. That helps the users be able to actually control the level of the water table in the field. So by having the flow blocked up, we're actually reducing the amount of runoff that's actually contributed to the watershed. So we're actually reducing the total volume of runoff to the watershed, which reduces the total nutrient loads. So we're reducing nutrient loads here by actually increasing infiltration. So this practice needs to be, I guess, managed throughout the course of the year. So when you're trying to get in the field to to actually plant and stuff like that, or to do some work, you wouldn't want to have the soils really saturated. So at that point in time, the farmers would take the gates out of the control structure, the water table in the field would be able to lower, and they can get out and do their field work, you know, without it being too muddy. And then after they're done, they can put those gates back in, raise the water table up in the field to kind of keep that water back on the landscape, and we can start to get all those environmental benefits from increasing that infiltration. So one thing about this is that this is a water management strategy used for, you know, controlling nutrient loading to the watershed, but there's a lot of people that look into the applicability of this for actually having some agronomic benefits as well. And there's some data that shows that by having, you know, that additional water in the field sometimes throughout the summer, that our crops can take advantage of that and actually have a yield benefit. So that kind of gets you thinking that, you know, that might be good, you know, agronomically, but I also, on the flip side of that, people need to be careful too, that they're not flooding out parts of their fields to where they're, you know, hurting their crops, or where they're backing up water onto places where it shouldn't be backed up onto. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go into actually installing one of these things, but the ACPF tool kind of gets you going on where those can be installed and which fields might be appropriate for the practice. So here's what the outputs of the drainage water management tool look like. So you can see that it's not actually showing you, you know, where you're going to want to install a drainage control structure. Like I said, it's going to take a lot more planning, but this tool does output some layers to help facilitate the planning process. So this uses a couple different layers to run the tool. One of them that was actually back in Toolbox 3 that I didn't mention was there's a tile drainage classification tool, and it doesn't actually output something that you can look at, but it's a table that is used as an input for the drainage water management tool, and that basically uses some of the data layers like the slope and the soil to allow users to come up with a determination of whether or not a particular field in a watershed likely has tile drainage or not. So the conditions that the users have to address when they're running these are, one, if the condition is based on the slope, they're looking to see if greater than or equal to 90% of the field has less than 5% slope. So they're thinking if most of that field has a low slope, that it's probably tile drained. Condition 2 is based on the soils, and there are actually 3 different conditions there that GIS techs can pick from, whichever one they think is more appropriate for their area. They can pick, and if the soil attributes in that field meet that condition, then that field will be flagged as a candidate for drainage water management. All right, so there's 2 conditions there. The GIS technician has to choose the and or option. So we're either going to choose condition 1 and condition 2, or we're going to do condition 1 or condition 2. All right, so that the idea here is that, you know, we can be either more restrictive or less restrictive with how many fields we want to classify as likely being tile drained based on these conditions. So for example, when I do this here in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Northwest Ohio, I know that it's really flat up here, and I know that we have a lot of really heavy clay soils. So I always opt for the or option to be more inclusive and cite more fields as likely being tile drained. All right. So there's some user specified conditions that also need to be set in order to run this tool. We have to set, the contour interval that is being used here, and actually that's what's being shown is as the output on the map. Those are actually contour intervals showing different elevations across the field. So depending on, the drainage control structure or the field, there's a little bit of wiggle room to what we want to say that drainage control structure is going to be trying to handle in terms of water that's coming from those different contours. So the way the tool works is it takes the user-defined contour interval and it slices up the field basically into that number of contours. And then it kind of equally distributes, that throughout the range of elevation across the field. And then for each one of those contours, if it meets the user-defined criteria for how much area needs to be controlled within that elevation range, if it meets the criteria, it will be flagged. The field will be flagged as a possible opportunity for this practice. All right, so it's a little bit confusing, but you can kind of think about how this is starting to work. And I've got some of the other layers shown up here that can kind of be used for actually planning to where you might want to put these. So the contour intervals kind of give you an area where you can visualize that that's going to be the area that the control structure is going to be backing up water. I have also on there some of the surface flow paths that can kind of show, okay, well, this is where the water is going to be flowing. And, that can kind of help guide, what part of this field you might try to be interested in installing one of these things and where you might be able to be effectively controlling water within the different subcatchments in the field here. So really, we went over the main modifications that can be made to the tool in that last slide there. Really, it's just the contour interval and the area that the minimum acreage in the field that contour interval defines. So there's a couple important things about setting the contour interval, I think, that you can take away from this, and that is if you set the number to be use larger contour intervals, you're ultimately going to end up needing more gates to actually control the water over the area of a watershed. If you use a smaller interval, you're going to end up identifying fewer fields and needing fewer gates ultimately. So the smaller intervals are actually more recommended for really flat watersheds because the smaller contour intervals are going to be appropriate because you obviously don't have that much elevation change over some of these small fields. Then I guess another note with this is that a single gate usually controls around a 1/2 meter change in elevation. So depending on the drainage control structure that you have, you might be, between 0.3 and 1.5 meters that you can control with these things, but on average, they're about a 1/2 meter. All right, so next practice here is the grass waterways practice. So grass waterways are actually installed to reduce the risk of concentrated flow or gully erosion in landscapes or in agricultural fields. This works by slowing down runoff as it enters that grassway and travels across there. That grass can actually get flattened down by the running water, and that kind of produces a type of mat on the surface that can help protect the soil. Another thing that actually these grass waterways do is having that root system down in those areas. Those roots kind of help increase soil strength, which can limit the detachment of soil particles that may otherwise be prone to, washing away in some of these larger flow events. These grass waterways are a pretty common practice. We can see a lot of these that do get installed all over the place. But they are overall underutilized. So if we run the ACPF tool, excuse me, if we run the ACPF tool, we might find that a lot of the outputs that are identified actually have grass waterways out there already. But there's always a lot of opportunities for additional installation of this practice in a lot of cases. So the inputs for this tool are the field boundaries layer, There's a stream power index raster, which is a kind of intermediate layer that was produced from the DEM in one of the previous tools. And then it also uses the streams layer. So here's an example of what the grass waterway outputs look like. This tool uses that SPI raster that I just mentioned. And it's basically a measure of the erosive power of flowing water. It predicts areas that have net erosion and net deposition. And it's basically just based on the topography of the landscape here. So this tool is pretty straightforward. It just basically allows users to set a threshold on that SPI index, and values that are greater than that threshold, they go through a little GIS processing chain that you can see here, and then the outputs are shown like what you have on the map. So the GIS processing chain is pretty simple. For every pixel in the SPI raster that is over the threshold value, it's reclassified as a 1. All of the ones then are in a line, are kind of smoothed, and they do an expansion and a thinning of those raster cells and then they convert it to a polyline later. So the output is a line layer, and it's indicative of what that SPI raster was actually showing. So the tool options. So really the only thing here is, like I said, that we can adjust that SPI threshold. So this slide is basically just showing what the process is, how that tool works. So the DEM, that's your raw DEM or the hydromodified DEM from the beginning. That's just showing all of the elevation data for the area. That's converted into this intermediate layer, the stream power index. And that's what's kind of given us that measure of concentrated flow across the landscape. Going down into that bottom picture there, so that's just a histogram of that stream power index raster. So that histogram is showing the distribution of all of the individual pixel values that are in that layer. So it's based off the DEM. So those are, again, 2-meter pixels, and it's just a summary of the whole layer. So you can see what the distribution looks like, and you can set a threshold on that distribution in number of standard deviations from the mean. And you can see what the outputs look like here in the map here. So I have a couple of different thresholds shown, and you can see that as I make the threshold smaller and smaller, so that would be getting closer and closer to the mean, we're including more pixels into that grass waterway output. So I find it, usually when I'm doing this, it's nice to run a few different thresholds, because you can see different results across the landscape, and it's kind of nice just to be able to flip on one and flip it off to see what's going to be best for that field, or if you want to think about maybe extending a grass waterway that exists, you can kind of loosen that threshold up. All right, so the next conservation practice is the contour buffer strips. So this is one of the few practices in ACPF. This is actually an in-field practice that would take a little bit of reconfiguring how a farmer would operate in the field. But the idea is this is kind of similar to what you would see with like a filter strip, is that these grass strips are planted perpendicular to the flow of water in a field. The idea is that these grass strips can slow the flow of the water, and it can trap some of the sediments and nutrients that are being transported in that runoff. Unlike traditional buffer strips at the edge of the field, this one follows the contours to intercept the runoff. And it's mostly applicable on landscapes that have a lot of topographic relief. I run this tool every time that I run an ACPF analysis in Northwest Ohio, and I think I've only probably ever seen an output from this tool, like maybe once in one spot on the terrain up in Northwest Ohio, because it's so flat. So depending on where you're working, you may or you may not get an output for this practice, depending on if it's, if it suits the landscape. So this is the outputs from the contoured buffer strip tool. The contoured buffer strips are the ones that are shown in yellow here. This map is actually showing grass waterways as well. So grass waterways are a kind of companion practice to this. And they're similar, and that they're just grass strips that are planted. The difference is, I guess, that the contour buffer strips are planted perpendicular to flow, whereas the grass waterways would be planted parallel to flow. The important thing I think about grass waterways is those are not actually designed to trap sediment. The whole point of the grass waterway is to transport water, whereas contour buffer strips, they can actually be used to filter out sediment and nutrients. Oops, my mouse is stuck. Just a second. Okay. All right, and in terms of modifications that we can make to the contour buffer strip tool, really the only thing that we can do here is we can adjust the buffer width of that tool. So it's a polygon, depending on the topography of the land and the way that the farmer operates. It might make more sense to do different widths for the buffer for this, or it might depend on what your conservation goals are for the field. So that is one of the modifications that we can be done with this tool, in case that's something that wants to be looked into. The next practice here is the edge of field bioreactor tool. So this tool actually is an edge of field practice. Like some of the other tools, it's using that drainage control structure, as you see, to intercept some of that tile water and reroute it through. It's basically a pit filled with wood chips, and that chemical reaction that occurs as the water passes through those wood chips actually removes some of the nitrogen from the runoff. And you can see that, yeah, here they're using a drainage control structure on both sides of those, one to kind of route it into the bioreactor, and on the other side they have a drainage control structure to help manage the flow of that water through the media. All right, so it's important to kind of use these and try to be careful when these are being installed to not also plug up the tile lines or back up water where it shouldn't be. And then you can see all of the different input layers that go into this. So field boundary, DEM, flow direction and flow accumulation are actually derived products from that DEM, the field tile drain status, and then the soil hydric status. So these are the outputs from the bioreactor tool. Here we have, there's two bioreactors that were cited here in this image. The bioreactors are those small polygons up there that indicate the location where the bioreactor would actually be sited in the field. So each feature has some attributes that are associated with it. So you could click on that bioreactor and you could come up with that information telling you the drainage area contributing to that bioreactor, or the total surface area that bioreactor would have to be if it were installed at that location, as well as the percent of hydric soils around that bioreactor. In terms of modifications for this tool, there's not really a whole lot you can change with it, aside from the options that you do make when you're running the tile drainage classification tool in 3B. So back in 3B, you had to go through that step of picking which fields you think are likely tile drained. So those decisions can alter where these bioreactors get sited, but when you get to the bioreactor tool itself, there's not actually any options at this point. They all would have to occur earlier on. But a couple of, I guess, takeaways from this, that, the installation of these bioreactors, they have to have an upland contributing area of at least 10 acres for the tool to site one of these in a location. And less than 90% of the soils around the installation installation of that bioreactor should not be hydric. And then when they're determining actually how large the bioreactor would need to be, the bioreactor surface area is shown as 0.5% of what the total drainage area is. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what the tool does when it's going through the process to figure out how to site these. And then got a couple other locations showing on this map where bioreactors actually were not cited, and just kind of a little thinking exercise to go through and get you thinking about what the tool is doing when it does cite these. So just asking why would the bioreactors not be cited in these locations? So number one, not labeled on an agricultural field. So here you can see there is a stream network that's running up through here. It's on the downside of it. And it could potentially be a good place if this was a field, but this is not in one of these ACPF field boundary locations. So the tool does not cite a bioreactor here. Number two, so this one's over here. So this one is inside the field boundary and it has water flowing through it. But in this case, it's saying that the contributing area is not small enough. So it doesn't meet that threshold for a contributing area. And then number three, over here, there would be no way to know this without really digging into all the soil layers, but it's saying that that location had too many hydric soils. So there was no bioreactor placed there. So just kind of give you an idea how the tool goes through the process of citing those things. And you can kind of think about, why or why not one of these might have been cited in the field.
Matt, there is a question in the chat about bioreactors and surface runoff from Wendy.
All right, let me pull that up here. So would there be a way, would there be a way to tweak the toolbox so the tile drainage is not required to cite a bioreactor? No, that's actually going to be a required input for this data layer to be, for the tool to actually run. So if you don't have that tile drainage classification, it won't be able to run the tool, period. So that step needs to happen first in order for the tool to run. And if the ACPF technician is going through the toolbox and the appropriate steps, that should be taken care of by the time they get to running this tool. So it is a process that requires, the technicians to go through a lot of those tools. And if they skip steps, some of the outputs might not be able to work. So thanks for asking that. And thanks, Kevin, for keeping an eye on the chat.
Matt, Matt, can I ask another question about that?
Sure.
And that is, would there be a way to use one of the other tools? I'm wondering about the depressions or the wascobs, which are also, I'm trying to think if those identify areas on a drainage path that might be suitable for a bioreactor that's not, but that would treat surface water.
So you're asking if a bioreactor could possibly make sense in like a depression location?
Well, I'm wondering if the way Wendy is talking about using a bioreactor is similar to a nutrient treatment wetland. Maybe that's a better parallel.
Oh, I'm just thinking in terms of how the tool operates. Like you have to have just all of the input layers that it's required in order for the tool to output. So I'm not saying that maybe a bioreactor wouldn't make sense in a different location that is not shown here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that in order for the tool to run properly, it has to have those layers. So there could be other circumstances where in a watershed, this might be an appropriate conservation practice, and the ACPF didn't pick up on it for some reason. But the whole point of this is to kind of go through the steps to show you kind of what the computer programming is thinking when it does the citing of these practices. And then if you guys know, okay, well, it's looking at like the hydric soils, and maybe that's why it got hung up. You can kind of go back and you use your your own knowledge of your local landscape to make that call as to whether or not one of these would be suitable.
Thanks.
Does that clear everything up?
Yeah, and I'm seeing Wendy is saying it's more comparable to treat wetland. So it's just by understanding what the practices are and understanding what the tool is doing, then you can make adjustments smartly.
Yeah. Yeah, this isn't going to be like the, the Bible when it comes to citing these conservation practices. This is supposed to give planners and landowners a tool of things to start considering. And really the idea here is to start conversations about practices and then see where that takes you. So this isn't like an engineering tool. It's more just to, start conversations and really, engage with stakeholders and landowners. All right, we'll keep the questions coming in, and please speak up if we got some more coming in, and we'll try to get to them. Okay, so the last tool, or the next toolbox that we're going to talk about here is the impoundment siting toolbox. So this toolbox focuses on practices that hold back water on the landscape. So nutrient removal wetlands, water and sediment control basins, and farm ponds all function in kind of a similar way. They all have some kind of built up structure that's used to impede the movement of water through the watershed. And you can think of the main difference kind of between these practices being the size that they take up on the landscape, and then what part of the landscape are these practices appropriate in. Okay, so we'll go through these here and you can see what those look like. So the first one here is the nutrient removal wetland. So this is a really popular tool. So wetlands serve an environmental function by being able to help reduce some of the nutrients and sediments that are being transported into the watershed, as well as providing flood storage and other kinds of ecological services for biological purposes and things. The nutrient removal wetland tool identifies depressional areas that occur along a concentrated flow path, and these would be locations that could be considered as appropriate for nutrient removal wetlands. So it's basically looking at the landscape and trying to figure out where would this practice fit on the landscape in kind of a natural way that wouldn't take a lot to really to build one of these things, because you could probably put a wetland anywhere, but this tool is showing us where they kind of naturally fit on the landscape. All right, so the inputs that this tool uses is the digital elevation model, the derived flow direction and flow accumulation layers, the stream reach, roads, and water bodies polygon, if that does exist. And then some citing considerations when this tool is running. So kind of the programmatic reasoning behind how these wetlands are cited. So water flows along these flow paths in the flow direction and the flow accumulation layers. So those are back in the earlier toolbox that we were delineating all of the surface flow and the catchments. It's using those layers to find out where those flow paths are. And then every so often along that flow path, it's going to stop and it's going to run this script to determine if it's a suitable place for nutrient removal wetland. And then it's going to be taking the inputs that the user gives it. So those user inputs are the impoundment height and the buffer height. And then it's going to just see if a wetland can fit there. And then if not, it'll go on to the next space up and test again. So it's kind of an iterative process. The nutrient removal wetland is one of the longer tools that it takes to actually run in terms of time when it's processing in the ARC toolbox. But there are a lot of different settings that users can adjust to make it go quicker or slower depending on how many settings you change. So this is what the results from the nutrient removal wetland look like. Basically, there's polygon layers that indicate where the nutrient removal wetland proper would be. So in this image here, you're seeing that kind of yellow cross-hatched area here. So that would be the nutrient removal wetland proper. That would stay wet most of the time, and it would have all of this vegetation in here, and that's going to be, as high as what the impoundment height is. It also shows the buffer area. Here we're showing it in this kind of lighter blue around the nutrient removal wetland. And that's going to be an area that has wetland vegetation in there, and it provides some additional variable storage capacity for water as you get these big rain events and water wants to pool up and move across the landscape. Some of these wetlands, you can design them to have more or less storage capacity in that buffer zone. And then the other output here that you get with the nutrient removal wetlands is the drainage area. So this is showing kind of the larger area that's actually going to be contributing to that nutrient removal wetland. So those are the GIS outputs. Like all of the other outputs, there's all of that data that comes in the attribute table as well. So it's showing you the area of the wetland and the buffer area in map view, as well as the storage capacity of the pool and the buffer zone. So that can help just trying to identify which one of these may be the most appropriate for the conservation plan in the watershed. And you can kind of look at these to try to help decide what properties you want to target or what makes sense. So there are a number of modifications that can be made to the nutrient removal wetland tool. These are all listed here. Really the important thing I think when we're running this is that there's to incorporate as many of the ancillary layers as you can. So you can see here that there's a road that cuts through this nutrient removal wetland. So that's one of the optional layers that you can load into this is if you have a roads layer, you can put that in and it won't cite a nutrient removal wetland that crosses a road like this, because that's just not really effective. Yeah, so there's a lot of other, there's a lot of other considerations that can go into this for citing the nutrient removal wetlands. I would definitely say that, people should check out the user's manual to kind of dig through what all of the details that are in this, because there are a lot of different things that you can change in here. And the spacing is kind of one of the things that you can change that will change how the tool iterates through identifying these locations. If you have a smaller number of spacings, it will check more places along that flow path. You can actually adjust the buffer height for the wetlands. You can adjust the impoundment height. So depending on what kind of nutrient reduction goals you have, these outputs can be actually tailored to specifically fit the landscape that you're wanting to work on. I think another important part of making these adjustments is, you can adjust the parameters of this tool to fit specifically with different program requirements that you might have from state to state, or whatever different funding programs are being used to pay for the installation of these things. They might have different requirements in terms of what the size of these things needs to be, or what the estimated environmental impact might be. So by looking through some of these different attributes and planning that the right way, you can kind of guide that to fit the scenario that you're working in the best. The next tool here is the water and sediment control basin. So this is a different kind of impoundment that's actually used in fields a lot of times. And the idea here is that it, like a nutrient removal wetland, it will attenuate some of that peak runoff and discharge. But the idea here with these wasp cobs is that they're smaller. The ground isn't going to stay or the water is not going to stay sitting in that pool for very long, not like a nutrient removal wetland. These will kind of temporarily back up water, allow it to slowly move across the landscape, and through that process we can get some environmental benefits from reducing some of the sediment and the nutrients that's being transported with that. So I actually haven't seen any of these in Ohio. I imagine that these could be a popular conservation practice in other places. Haven't seen them myself, but every time I run an ACPF analysis, there are always at least a few opportunities for these to be sited on the landscape. So this is something I guess I'm kind of interested in seeing if there are any of these around and how effective they are in our region. So again, different practices are more appropriate in different areas, and that's really just going to depend on where you're at. So the inputs for this tool, this uses the DEM, the flow accumulation and flow direction layers, the field boundaries, the streams, and then the watershed boundary. Those are all the input layers to the WASCOB tool. This is what the outputs look like. So basically there's a polyline attribute. It's kind of small here, but it's just a small line feature that actually shows where that impoundment would be sited, and then it's showing you the area behind that impoundment that would be potentially holding back water. So in the attribute tables for each of these features, you can get information like the contributing area in acres to that water and sediment control basin. You can also get information as to the elevation of the drainage way and the bank heights on each end of those, each end of the impoundment. And then for the basin, you can get information on the potential storage in volume, and then the surface area that basin might take up in the field. All right, so this is just another impoundment practice. A lot of times you'll see these in landscapes that have more topography. And a lot of times what you'll see is there will be kind of a train of wasp cobs where one will flow into another along a flow path. That's kind of the normal way these things work. In a lot of the flatter landscapes, you can see that there's usually maybe just one or two of these things that end up getting sited. All right, so modifications that we can make to the WASCOB tool. So the embankment height is selected by the users, and that can actually range from 1 meter to 4.5 meters. So depending on the landscape and how much topographic relief there is, you might be able to get away with building a smaller one. If you have, the landscape that would take one of these big ones and you cite the smaller one on there, that's when you usually end up getting several smaller ones that will be kind of sited in a train. Whereas if you use the bigger one, you might just have one large wasp cob that has a really large basin of water behind it. So in order for the tool to cite these things, it's looking at subcatchments that have at least 2 to 50 acres of contributing area that would flow into that wasp cob. Flow points, it's kind of the same way as the nutrient removal wetland. And it looks at that concentrated flow path, and then every so often along that concentrated flow path, it checks to see if this is an appropriate practice at that location. Yeah, this 100-meter transect. So that's just the line that's drawn perpendicular to that point on the flow path. and then the elevation profile is evaluated. So just the kind of programmatic way that the tool goes through trying to figure out if that's an appropriate place at that location. And then for the siting requirements, there's a couple here. The height of the drainage, the height of each side of the drainage way must be at least the height of the embankment, but it can't be any more than 2 times the height of the embankment. Right? So the tool will look at the elevation model in those areas. It'll determine that, and using those considerations, it will decide whether or not WASCOB makes sense at that location. All right, and then our last impoundment to talk about is the farm ponds tool. And farm ponds are a constructed type of impoundment that can capture surface runoff. They can trap sediment. They can be used to provide irrigation on farms, and they also enhance biodiversity. So ACPF looks for ideal conditions along that flow path, the same way as the other one did, and just kind of goes through this processing chain of figuring out if, based on that flow path and where we are on the landscape, does a farm pond fit here? So, it's looking for places that have a narrow section of the valley so that you can actually put some kind of impoundment up across there to block up the water. The valley should have steep sided slopes and a very flat floor. And then we're also looking again that minimum contributing area that needs to drain into the farm pond to make it an appropriate location. So if you look back, if we were to look back at the requirements for the nutrient removal wetland as an impoundment, that one actually requires, I think, it said 60 hectares of land contributing to the drainage area, which is about 148 acres. So a nutrient removal wetland would require larger land to drain it into it, whereas a farm pond could be smaller. So this tool takes the digital elevation model as an input, and then you can actually put the roads layer in here optionally, so you don't cite one of these things crossing a road like we've seen with the nutrient removal wetland example. All right, and here's an example of what the farm pond output looks like. So this, like the other ones, is a polygon feature class, has a couple of different locations in here. So it'll show you the pond proper, the freeboard area, which is kind of that buffer area up around the edge of the pond, where if the water rises in a heavy flow event, there's some of that additional area for the water to take up. And then that purple polygon is showing the contributing area, so the drainage area that's flowing into that pond. And then, as with the rest of the GIS layers, there's this attribute table associated with the pond that can give you more details about the area and the storage area of the pond. So in terms of modifications for the farm pond tool, there's not really any modifications that can be made to this tool. It's run pretty much just straightforward using those input layers, and you get the results. I would also say that, in my experience running the farm pond tool, I run this one every time, and I think I've only had an output for a farm pond once, and it was a location that a pond already existed. So again, I think it's having to do with the topography of the land and what's required in terms of the contributing area and the steepness of the slopes and things that just make it, up here in the flat Western Lake Erie Basin, it's just apparently not appropriate in most cases. So here's an example kind of showing 2 locations on this watershed here. This is the base map is your digital elevation model. So you can see kind of what the elevation of the land surface looks like here. At location 1, the tool cited a farm pond. At location 2, it did not. And it's just showing here that you can look at this DEM, and you can tell at location 2 that we're talking about a much lower depressional area. It's a lot lower slope going into this than number 1. So because of that, the software identified site 1 as a possible location, but not site 2. All right. Okay, now the last toolbox is here is the riparian assessment tool. So I will just go through this. So there's a couple tools in here to look at possible conservation options that can occur in that riparian corridor along a stream network. So there's often opportunities to reduce nutrient and sediment loss in those riparian corridors and all agricultural watersheds, really. These opportunities focus on managing the vegetation in those riparian zones, and they usually don't require farmland to be taken out of production, so that can be a really good selling point to people that might be interested in using some of these outputs. So practices like planting vegetation to stabilize stream banks that could be prone to erosion helps reduce nutrient sediment loss in watersheds. Where the terrain characteristics and the soil characteristics are appropriate, deep-rooted vegetation can also be planted to help facilitate potentially denitrification in the riparian zone. In other cases, different types of vegetation may be preferable depending on whatever the specific characteristics of the watershed are. So the riparian function assessment tool can actually be used to help plan for what those site-specific considerations should be along different portions of that stream network throughout the watershed. So this tool is using the streams layer, the riparian catchments, and then there's a height above channel raster layer that is another one of those DEM derivative products that's produced prior to running this tool. All right, so this tool is kind of complicated to initially get your head wrapped around what's going on here with it, but ultimately I think that this is one of the most valuable tools in ACPF, at least for my applications. But the process here is really, it's focusing on the use of two different variables in that riparian catchment. So it's looking at the potential for a riparian zone within each catchment to provide denitrification of shallow groundwater. Right, so this is based on the width of the low-lying land within 90 meters of the stream. All right, so the topography of the land near the riparian zone impacts the level at which shallow groundwater may be present. All right, so in all riparian systems, you know, the stream network is going to be the lowest elevation point, and then just adjacent to that stream, there's usually kind of a low-lying flat, you know, plane where the next to the stream, and then as you move out in distance from there, elevation starts to rise, and you go up in elevation through the watershed. So depending on what that how big of an area is, you know, with that low lying elevation between the channel and the upland area further out, that's going to really have an impact on how much potential subsurface shallow water is moving through the subsurface into that stream. So that's the first variable that we're looking at across the top of the chart there. The second variable on the side of the chart is really looking at the amount of drainage area that's passing through that riparian zone from each catchment. So larger catchments naturally have larger quantities of runoff that pass through their respective riparian corridors, right? So that's what is being shown here. On one axis is basically how much water is being contributed to each segment of the riparian corridor, and on the other one is how big is that flat, you know, that flat space between the stream and the upland areas. And then basically it's taking those two variables, making three classes for each one of them, and then plotting them here in this type of classification matrix. So you can kind of look at whatever the local landscape characteristics are, and then depending on where you fall into that classification matrix, you might find that it's better to maybe plant a multi-species buffer, or depending on what it is, you might fall into the stiff stemmed grasses category. Deep-rooted vegetation, so this would be something for helping with denitrification. Stream bank stabilization, so these would be the really small small catchments, so really small contributing areas, but a really high kind of slope area going into the stream bank. So you can think that that's going to be more appropriate for stream bank stabilization. Again, with this tool, the output of this tool is a table. The table actually has to be joined to one of the spatial layers. So there's a couple of options for displaying the riparian function assessment. That table can be joined to the riparian attributes polygon, which is what I'm showing here. So this is actually just the stream network. It's basically done a polygon buffer around the stream network, the perennial stream network, that is. And it's extracted some of those attributes from the table into those. So you can see what portions of the stream network would be best suited for those different options. The other option is to join that table to the riparian catchments layer, which I have shown down here. And this is kind of good for planning purposes if you're trying to look at the whole watershed and figure out where your opportunities to maybe focus on some of these different things are. And then you can kind of zoom into the smaller field scale and look at actually the different stream segments once you know what part of the watershed you want to focus on. Yep, so that's the riparian function assessment. And then we also have another tool here from ACPF is the saturated buffer tool. So saturated buffer is another edge of field practice that can remove excess nutrients from subsurface tile drainage water before it makes its way out into the receiving ditch. This practice also utilizes the drainage control structure here. But in this case, instead of just blocking up the water in the field, it has these lateral distribution lines that come out and they run parallel with that riparian corridor. And those distribution lines actually allow the water to infiltrate through that whole riparian zone and saturate that vegetated buffer area here. So this is a really effective practice at removing nutrients from tile runoff. I think initially they were focusing on the ability for this thing to remove nitrogen from water, but I think that there's actually been a lot of success removing phosphorus using this method as well. So there's some important considerations that need to be considered when putting one of these things in. The big thing is that in order for a saturated buffer to work effectively, the slope of the land needs to be just right. So we're actually getting that water to back up and saturate this buffer zone, but we don't want it to actually get back here into the field to where it's actually doing damage to the crops. So you have to have the right kind of slope here. It can't be too high or too low. But in the areas where it's just right, this can be a really effective practice. So the inputs for this layer are just the stream reach. There's the catchments, DM, the slope raster. It looks at the soils layer as well, and the land use. So the output of the saturated buffer tool is a table also, which can be joined to the spatial layers like I showed you in the previous example. And it basically is the same thing. So you can use it on the watershed to kind of look at the whole large area and determine where in the watershed you might want to start focusing on trying to promote this practice with landowners. And once you've kind of identified the part of the watershed, you can zoom into the field scale and you can use that riparian attributes polygon to narrow it down to what stream segments you actually want to focus on here. So the outputs here just classify each of the stream segments and subcatchments as a yes, it's appropriate for saturated buffer, or no, it's not. In some cases it says yes, but it requires a carbon enhancement. All right, and the reason that that's there is for those for the ability for this practice to be used for denitrification. In order for it to be effective, there has to be a minimum amount of soil organic matter for denitrification to occur successfully. So that's why that is an output here. It might be something to consider differently if you're thinking about just applying this for phosphorus. But like I said, traditionally, I think that the idea was using this for nitrogen reduction. So that's why that carbon enhancement is in there. In terms of modifications that you can make to the saturated buffer tool, there are a handful of them depending on what the specific situation is that you're working with in a watershed. You can adjust the minimum organic matter percentage from 1.5 to 5.1%. So depending on what your needs are for this practice, you can adjust that. You can adjust the percent of coarse soils that are present in the area. So that can range from 50 to 75%. And then you can also adjust this minimum percent of riparian zone that must contain slopes between 2 and 8%. So I put range from 25 to 75, but I don't think that's right. I'll have to fix that. And then also the maximum bank height here. So the bank height for this saturated buffers is important, and that can actually range from 8 to 14 feet depending on where in the watershed you're at. So a couple of options and siting considerations that are taken in when the tool is actually locating where these are appropriate. All right, so that was the last conservation practice tool that I have to go through with you. This slide here has a couple of additional resources that you guys can take advantage of. I know that this technical talk it's a little bit in depth, and for people who are not GIS users, it can kind of get into the weeds a little bit. I tried to make it at least somewhat digestible for you, but when you start to dig into this, there's probably going to be a need for you to do some more research on the individual outputs, and there's a bunch of resources that we have here that you can use to do that. So the ACPF Users Manual, I would highly suggest, if you haven't already, to kind of thumb through that and look at the amazing amount of detail that they've put into that. That should answer just about any of the questions that you would have with this. But there's a guide for landscape specific decisions. We're making these videos for the technical training, and then there's the science behind the tools. So any kind of peer-reviewed publications that exist out there using ACPF, you can be able to find those and reference those for your needs as well. So I think that the links to these are actually going to be sent out, or they might drop them in the chat here, or are going to be sent out into a follow-up email, so you guys will have access to those. And the last thing that I was hoping to have people do here, so as an evaluation for me. So I'm a public employee, and doing these evaluations is something that I'm required to do. If you guys wouldn't mind to take this evaluation, let me know how I did today. Ultimately, the goal of this is so I can learn how, what I did works good and what doesn't, so I can serve you better in the future. So I would appreciate it if you guys could take this evaluation by going to this link here. Let's see, and somebody can drop this into the chat real quick. And then there's also an access code in case anybody has asked for it. Sometimes it does ask for an access code. So I'll put these in the link here, or it looks like Janice has got them in the chat here. So you can click on the link, and then if you want, you can copy and paste that access code in there. And I would really appreciate you helping me out and helping me figure out how I can do these trainings better for you in the future. So I appreciate it. And I'll let you guys work on that, and then I'll let Marcel come back and wrap this presentation up. So thanks again for being with us today, and feel free to reach out to me if you got any more questions. And I'll also take some questions if anybody has any. So thanks.
Matt, that was a wonderful fire hose. So thanks for getting that all pulled together. Are there questions out there about this? I don't know, Matt, if you want to stop sharing, I'm going to share a different link because there's two different. So Matt was sharing an evaluation of him as an instructor. But we also have this link, which is also in your agenda, for some feedback from today. And it's just two quick questions. And the first one is, do you have any questions from today? So I encourage you to use this over the next day or so as you think of questions about what you heard today. And at the beginning on Thursday, we'll address those questions that you send in. Yeah, Janice added this link to the chat as well.
Because we do have time, obviously, if you want to unmute and ask questions, you definitely can. But we also ask that you would use that forum for other things and questions that come up after we end the session this morning.
Yep. Let's see. So I think on Thursday, we have 3 very different case studies that we're going to share with you about how people in Indiana, Minnesota, I'm trying to remember where the third one's from, Iowa, have used the ACPF over the years, and they're very different approaches. So I think it'll be really useful for giving you some ideas of how you can fit this into your own conservation planning and implementation. Any other questions right now?
Hi, this is Wendy in California, and this might be a bit of an obvious question, but as you were going through the farm pond tool, it sounded like it was pretty exclusive. It didn't return a lot of results because of the topographic parameters that are required. And I was just wondering, is excavation of a farm pond ever sort of considered as an option? And we often do that here. You know, there's some degree of excavation that goes on to create a farm pond. So that's the question.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's like you were saying. It's just because of the landscape here. We're really flat in Northwest Ohio, so I don't see a lot of these. If there is, you know, excavation done, that would definitely, you know, be something that could increase the opportunities for something like that. The ACPF is kind of just looking at the landscape, so it's based on the terrain that exists right there at the given time, whenever that data was captured. So if there's, you know, more alterations that could help that out, that could be a possibility.
Yeah, I wonder if it could be sort of reverse engineered, right? Like if you had a farmer who was interested in a farm pond and had a potential site, like could you go back and sort of look at like what I mean, I guess you could do that anyway. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud. Just in terms of like what the catchment area would be in the storage, but I suppose that could also be done just with, you know, regular processing tools.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of what the process you would go through just to delineate the catchment from a given point anyway. So yeah, I think it's kind of like you were saying.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder if the depression tool would be another approach to figure out the volume of the depressions that you're looking at, and then take the next step of calculating what an excavation would do.
Yeah, that's a good idea too, because the depression tool was one of the things it's looking at is where it can potentially site restored wetlands, right? So that would take a little bit more engineering to get to the point where you would be installing a wetland, but it could naturally fit in those locations.
All right, well, barring any questions, let's wrap up and we'll see you all on Thursday. Anything to add, Kevin or Janice?
Nope, we appreciate everybody's time, everybody's sticking through the session, and hope nobody's upset that we end a few minutes early here. But hopefully you've got good information, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday.